Okay, here's what we actually know. Humans have been inhaling smoke from burning plants for longer than we have had agriculture writing or cities. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is how deep the rabbit hole actually goes. 8 answers, starting from the edge of human history and working our way back to something older than that. Number 8. The first smoke wasn't an accident. The oldest evidence for controlled fire on Earth doesn't come from a campfire myth. It comes from a cave in South Africa called Wonderwerk, which fittingly means miracle in Afrikaans. In 2012, a team led by archaeologist Francesco Berna published findings in the journal PNAS. Inside the cave, 1 million years old and buried under layers of sediment, they found burned bone fragments and plant ash. Not the result of a natural wildfire blowing through. The deposits were too consistent, too contained. This was deliberate fire management by Homo erectus. Homo erectus were our evolutionary ancestors, not us. Smaller brain, an entirely different world. But they were keeping fire alive in an enclosed space. And here's what that means physically. If you maintain a fire inside a cave, you breathe the smoke. There is no version of controlled indoor fire that doesn't involve inhalation. The first smoke wasn't a choice. It was a side effect of surviving. The romantic campfire story usually leaves that part out. Number 7. 12,300 years before your last smoke break. For most of modern history, scholars assumed tobacco was a relatively recent habit, something indigenous Americans developed, which Europeans then discovered and spread globally. That timeline collapsed in 2021. Archaeologist Darren Duke and his team were excavating the Wishbone site in Utah's Great Salt Lake Desert when they found something inside a limestone hearth tobacco seeds charred and burned, dating back 12,300 years. This wasn't accidental. Seeds don't fall into hearths by themselves. Someone put them there. To put that in context, 12,300 years ago is older than Stonehenge, older than the Egyptian pyramids. Agriculture hadn't been invented yet in most of the world, and people in the Utah desert were already deliberately burning tobacco at a fireplace. The study was published in Nature Human Behavior. The researchers noted the seeds were found in a location consistent with intentional use, not food preparation. Whatever was happening at that hearth 12,300 years ago, it was not a meal. Number 6. The historian everyone called a liar. Around 440 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote something that scholars would dismiss for the next 2,000 years. He described a Scythian burial ritual. The mourners would construct a small tent place, heated stones inside throw hemp seeds onto them, and sit inside the smoke. He called it a vapor bath. He said they howled with pleasure. The problem was that no physical evidence existed. Herodotus had a reputation for embellishment. He was wrong about enough things that it was easy to write this off as another tall tale. Then, in the 1940s and 50s, Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko excavated the Pazyryk burial mounds in the Altai Mountains. Inside one of them, a small felt tent. Inside the tent, a copper brazier. And in the brazier, hemp seeds. Exactly what Herodotus described, right down to the equipment. The lesson, and it comes up again and again in archaeology, is that ancient sources dismissed as mythology have a frustrating tendency to turn out to be accurate. Number 5. 2 worlds, 1 answer. On opposite sides of the planet, 2 civilizations with no contact, no shared language, and no possibility of cultural exchange arrived at the same conclusion about certain plants. That conclusion was, these are not ordinary substances. In the Americas, indigenous cultures treated tobacco as a sacred medium, a bridge between the human world and the spirit world. It wasn't recreational. It was ceremonial. Shamans used it to communicate, to heal, to mark transitions between states of being. The smoke carried the message. In ancient India, the Atharva Veda, one of the oldest sacred texts in existence, composed over 3,000 years ago, lists Pong a preparation of cannabis among the 5 sacred plants given to humanity by Shiva. In the Vedic tradition, it was used in ritual contexts as a means of achieving states beyond ordinary consciousness. Grief meditation communion with the divine. 2 separate civilizations, completely independent of each other, both deciding that a burning plant was a doorway rather than just a drug. The pattern is worth noticing. These weren't fringe practices, they were integrated into the most serious religious frameworks these cultures had. Number 4. The grave goods that changed everything. In 2019, a study published in Science Advances analyzed wooden burial braziers found on the Pamir Plateau in what is now Western China, dating to approximately 500 BCE. The researchers ran gas chromatography on the residue inside. What they found was cannabis. But not just any cannabis. The THC concentration in the residue was significantly higher than wild-growing cannabis plants in the same region produce. Someone had been selecting specifically for potency. This matters because it demolishes the idea that early cannabis use was accidental or incidental, a plant that happened to be around. The people burying their dead in the Pamir Mountains were making deliberate choices about which plants to burn in ritual contexts and were selecting for the plants that produced the strongest effect. The site sits along what would become the Silk Road, which means this wasn't an isolated practice. It was positioned at a crossroads. Number 3. The world's oldest prescription. The Ebers Papyrus is one of the oldest surviving medical documents of significant length. It dates to approximately 1550 BCE and was acquired by the German Egyptologist Georg Ebers in the 19th century. Today it's held at the University of Leipzig. It contains over 700 prescriptions, among them cannabis, used as an anti-inflammatory, used for pain management, used in gynecological treatments for complications during childbirth. Here's what makes this remarkable. The pharmacological logic of those applications hasn't changed. The conditions ancient Egyptian physicians were treating cannabis with 3,500 years ago are almost exactly the conditions for which medical cannabis is prescribed. Today, pain, inflammation, specific women's health applications. The pharmacology didn't change. The politics around it did. Number 2. Your body built the lock. In 1988, pharmacologist Alan Howlett and her graduate student William Devane at St. Louis University School of Medicine were studying where cannabis compounds bind in the brain. They were looking for receptor sites, protein structures, that respond to specific chemical signals. They found them. Receptor proteins in rat brain tissue that responded directly to compounds in cannabis. What they hadn't expected was the distribution. These receptors weren't in one region of the brain. They were everywhere. The cannabinoid receptor, later named CB1, turned out to be the most abundant neurotransmitter receptor in the mammalian brain. The implication was immediate. A receptor this widespread doesn't exist because a plant exists. It exists because the body produces its own versions of those compounds. By 1992, that system had been identified and named the endocannabinoid system. CB1 receptors sit primarily in the brain and central nervous system. CB2 receptors appear mainly in the immune system. Together, they regulate mood memory, pain response appetite, and sleep. The system has since been found in virtually every vertebrate on Earth. Fish, reptiles, birds, mammals, hundreds of millions of years before modern humans existed. Your body didn't evolve a lock for a key that plants hold. It evolved a system, and cannabis happens to fit one part of it. Number 1. Animals were doing it first. In 1989, psychopharmacologist Ronald Siegel published a book called Intoxication. His argument was straightforward and deeply uncomfortable. The pursuit of altered states of consciousness is not a human behavior. It is an animal behavior. Reindeer in Siberia seek out Amanita muscaria mushrooms and consume them deliberately, then behave in ways consistent with intoxication. African elephants go significantly out of their way to find and eat fermented marula fruit. Birds in several species actively consume fermented berries. Wallabies in Tasmania break into opium poppy fields. Cats roll in catnip, a plant that produces nipetolactone, a compound that triggers opioid receptors. Siegel called this the fourth drive as fundamental to animal biology as hunger thirst and reproduction. A drive that shows up independently across species with no shared culture, no shared social structure, and no possibility of having learned it from one another. If you want evidence that this is ancient, consider the oldest controlled fire is 1 million years old. The endocannabinoid system in your brain predates humanity by hundreds of millions of years. And animals with no concept of ritual or culture have been seeking out mind-altering plants since long before our ancestors climbed down from the trees. The next time you smell wood smoke on a cold night, you're sharing something with a lineage that goes back further than you can comfortably imagine. You're doing what living things have always done,